Hi, Massimo. I hope all is good with you. This time we're going to talk about a one-year anniversary of so-called Abraham Accord, or Accords, because they managed to normalize ties between not only UAE and Bahrain on one side and Israel on another, but Sudan and Morocco normalized diplomatic relations with Israel. And these days we witness a coup d'etat in Sudan. And we should see what will coup d'etat in Sudan mean for Abraham Accords. Although I don't think that Sudan will take a different path from the path they took after Omar Bashir was deposed last year. So how you see Abraham Accords after 1 year?
So, I think we're gonna be looking back a few years down the road to the Abraham Accords as one of the pivotal moments in the the relationship between the Palestinians and Israeli, the whole Israeli-Arab issues. Is one of those moments like Camp David Accords, like the Oslo Accords, that for better or worse will define this dispute. The Abraham Accords, I think, signal two things primarily. One is that the Arab states at large are getting more and more tired, even from a public image, even from a public posture perspective about the Palestinian issue. I don't think, Arab states have always been really, truly committed to solve the Palestinian issue, in all sorts of ways. But at least they put up a facade, a veneer of, commitment to the so-called peace process, or whatever you want to define it as. The Abraham Accords are a little, actually quite a momentous change in that regard, that they're not even, they've switched to a place where the interaction and then official recognition of Israel is actually is actually something they can contemplate. Not only that, it's something they can actually sign on to. Which, I mean, if you look at history, these are, the same countries that the famous 3 no's of Khartoum in 1967 after the 6-Day War. No to negotiation, no to recognition, no to peace with Israel. And time passes for everybody. 60 years later, almost, the landscape has dramatically changed. And insofar as the recognition of Israel is also a way to distance oneself from the Palestinian peoples and the Palestinian cause, then the Abraham Accords are to be considered also as a step away, as a way to distance oneself from the Palestinian position. That's one thing. The other thing that I wanted to stress is that the elephant in the room to me when it comes to this accord is not Israel, is not the Palestinians, is Iran. This is a series of accord that is trying to build a common front about what is perceived by the Gulf countries, Israel, and the US administration as at the moment the more dangerous threats to a certain order in the Middle East. And if you look at who signed the agreement, these are countries that have either bad or terrible relations with Iran, and a common enemy can unify fronts that may not have many more reasons to get along. So on the one hand, I think this shift in Arabs posturing when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian question, and then the Iranian issue on the other.
Do you think that Iranians and Palestinian Arabs are the losers of Abraham Accords?
So it's hard for me to see how Palestinians can benefit from this. Now, I don't want to, let's try and play devil's advocate. Let's try to contest my, my position here. First of all, I could say that, for example, if Israel feels less threatened, this is a logic that is always, coming up. If Israel feels less threatened by its neighbors, he may be in a more conciliatory position when it comes to other issues, including the Palestinian issue, right? So you make peace with Israel, you make Israel feel more confident, more and safer in its own position. Now he's in a position perhaps to go out and talk to the Palestinians. That could be one. The other aspect is that part of the Abraham Accords, at least in the original Trump framework, so to speak, would entail a series of economic, how can I say, sponsorships or helps or aids to the Palestinians. So to promote some sort of like economic development in the occupied territories. Now, the Palestinians have rejected that, but there is, we could be hopeful or naive or however you want to put it, that some sort of economic progress for the Palestinian people is something that should be welcome nevertheless, if this aid package actually comes to fruition. Aside from that, I do not see how the Palestinians who have lost the diplomatic support in terms of the non-recognition of Israel from their fellow Arabs can find the Abraham Accords, helpful for their position. So that's something that I'm struggling to see, to be honest. When it comes to Iran, yeah, the situation is even more complicated, perhaps, because on the one hand, I do see the Abraham Accords the way I described it, as a way to kind of, form a common front against Iran. At the same time, the Biden administration is considering to revive the JCPOA, this weird acronym that they crafted to describe the accord on the nuclear program with Iran that was rebuked and revoked by Trump in 2018, if I'm not mistaken. And the fact that Iran may be welcome back, or maybe welcome back in the international community by virtue of that agreement, right? By virtue of that accord, you may signal to the international community that Iran is not anymore a party, is not anymore enemy number one. So there is this double, a set of concerns, so to speak, that go on with Iran. And why that is the case? Well, because insofar as the JCPOA, the accord with Iran, is, of course, primarily an affair of the United States of America. Of course, it's like the 5+1, basically the 5 members of the UN Security Council plus Germany. But, the United States are the ones who call the shot. In this sense, we should try and see the JCPOA as the brainchild of the United States. Now, why they're doing that? Why, on the one hand, to form this front through the Abraham Accords against Iran, and on the one hand have this opening? Let's talk about the JCPOA once again, right? Let's consider that once more. Well, because we shouldn't get too fixated with permanent positions in politics, Saib. I think that if the United States see the opportunity and see a reason, a rationale to welcome back Iran into the international community, they're going to do it. What could be that reason now is the following. The United States have, like all great powers, have one major concern when it comes to regions of the world that are, far away from their homeland, the Middle East, East Asia, Africa.
Okay, but still, these regions are very vital for their geopolitical interests.
Absolutely.
This is the characteristic of the empire. Empire never waits its enemies to come on their territories. They expand and they fight on on other people's territories, they exploit their resources and they damage their infrastructure far away from metropolis.
Absolutely, Saab. No, you're completely right. What I wanted to say is the following: in order to maintain control and influence in the Middle East, the primary goal for the United States is that no local hegemon or regional power would emerge. For the United States, it's great to have many different centers of power that are all competing with each other, because as long as they compete with each other, they don't really compete with the United States, right?
True.
So
this is true.
There is Israel, and then there is Saudi Arabia potentially. There used to be Egypt way back when Egypt was a power in the region. Now there is Iran, who has the capacity to become a regional hegemon. But they might want to play Iran against what they perceive is now the more challenging actor, which is Turkey, which is, extending its reach throughout the Mediterranean basin, in the Caucasus, in the Balkans, and Turkey is another state that has huge population, very good, social and human capital, are not thriving, but a relevant economy that is not just based on, natural resources and stuff. So they say, you know what? We are not sure what happens with Turkey. Let's just have an opening potentially with Iran, just in case. And I think, the United States, that's what they do. They become smarter in making sure that all these different countries are primarily involved in disputes with each other, as opposed to, having some sort of grievance against the states.
But this is what they did with Iraq in 1991, when Iraq became a regional player and they threatened Israel. And that was the key moment when they decided to topple Saddam Hussein and to drag Iraq into Kuwait, which was also their making.
Yeah. No, you're completely right, Saib. Yeah. If you look at it, right, in 1991, they wanted to prevent Iraq from becoming the regional hegemon. Iraq had the population, the natural resources, and the willingness with Saddam's plans to become such a country. Yeah. And they decided to intervene, right? You could also look at, the Iran-Iraq war, when they thought that Iran could become a potential hegemon after the revolution. They basically mobilized Iraq in that case to fight Iran, right? So yeah.
What do you think about Palestinian position regarding Abraham Accords? Because Palestinians de facto recognized the state of Israel a long time ago, before even Oslo peace accord. So they shouldn't be so angry at other Arab states to normalize ties with Israel, because Palestinian National Authority and Hamas in Gaza also recognized the state of Israel. They gave up the idea of historical Palestine and Palestinian state from Dead Sea to Mediterranean, and de facto they acknowledge the presence of the Zionist entity, which they like to call, they like this term, Zionist entity.
Yeah.
Like it's some kind of science fiction novel, and you have these different entities from galaxies and different solar systems. But I mean, Palestinian Arabs themselves recognize the state of Israel. After Egypt, the second state which normalized ties with Israel was Jordan, where 70% of the population are Palestinian Arabs. So I see a kind of hypocrisy in their protests against Sudan or Bahrain normalizing ties with the state of Israel, and at the same time, all these Arab states and pseudo-states have diplomatic ties with the United States, and actually the U.S. is the main partner for most of them. If we don't count on Syria, all Arab states are more or less in bed with the U.S. and they have strong economic, political, military ties. I mean, United Arab Emirates and Bahrain didn't have to sign any kind of peace treaty. They never officially they were never in the war with Israel.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what they expect from them? That's kind of hypocritical. At the same time, you have economic ties with the Zionist identity. Your workers go from Gaza or West Bank to work in Israel or territories controlled by Israelis. And at the same time, you're pissed off that United Arab Emirates established economic ties with Israel.
Well, Sam, I think this is a very interesting point that you just made, you are correct. Before I address that, I just want to underline something that goes back to our first conversation.
Of course,
you basically listed all the Arab states that are in bad or that have good relations with the United States. And basically, yeah, if you go around the clock and you consider all the different Arab states, you may point Syria and maybe Iraq, but I'm not sure. So
Iraq
you really
is
have to struggle.
under American occupation. Iraq is also yeah.
It's just I was thinking about the Iranian influence there, but you're right, meaning that when we start, the Americans, the empire is crumbling, and I'm like, all the Arab states except Syria are basically at their disposal. What are we talking about here exactly?
Of course, they have a military presence in Iraq.
Yeah,
2010,
absolutely.
2011, they withdrew military, and after Daesh started its campaign, they came back.
Yeah,
they may withdraw military, or they may stay, or they may send more contingents. We don't know, but their presence is in Iraq.
Absolutely. I mean, and you could even say that they have military or security services presence in Syria as well, in some parts.
Or in Pakistan.
Or I mean, so before we sing the eulogy of American empire, we shall wait a little bit.
Yeah.
To your point about the Palestinians, that's a very fine point, Saad. And of course, you're correct when you say that explicitly the Palestinian National Authority is not only recognizing Israel, is actually the son of an agreement between the PLO and Israel. Like the PNA has Israel in its DNA. It's even deeper than that. And of course, the framework of the Oslo Accords and Declaration of Principles and all the rest of it was basically recognizing the right of Israel to exist on the part of the Palestinian within the 1967 borders, right? So that whole part of historic Palestine, as you correctly pointed out, has been given up. There is no more, in other words, a desire or political plan to, quote unquote, destroy the state of Israel as it emerged in 48, 49, right? So that's one thing. Also, correctly, you pointed out that Hamas, for all its rhetoric, by joining, for example, in the electoral political process in 2006 and joining the Palestinian National Authority, at an official level, also recognizing indirectly Israel. So we are in a position where the main Palestinian institution, the Palestinian National Authority, and one of the major Palestinian forces, the Hamas, directly or indirectly recognize the state of Israel already. So why would the Palestinians get so mad about the Abraham Accords? I feel because, Palestinians have very, very few cards to play at the moment. You may look back to the Oslo Accords, and today actually was an article on Al Jazeera about the 30 years of the Madrid Conference that basically preceded in 1991 the Oslo Accords, right? Many commentators also, for example, the late, great Edward Said were really, really critical about the Oslo Accords because they were like, the Palestinians recognize Israel as a state. Israel only recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinians, right? So it was not a one-to-one deal, so to speak. Somebody gave up more on the table. Having given up the possibility, I mean, having given up the diplomatic recognition of Israel back then, they kind of cornered themselves. They don't have many more things that they can withdraw from Israel on the negotiation table. I think deep down they have, of course, understood this blunder on the negotiation table that is basically haunted them ever since. And what they see now is Arabs making the same mistake, so to speak, in their eyes, saying you're giving up the best card you have to try and influence Israel policy, Israel plans in Israel-Palestine. Now, this is a little bit of a cry in the wilderness because, of course, Bahrain and the Arab Emirates and Morocco, if I am one of the officials of this country, what is more beneficial for my country, to support the Palestinians or to strike a deal with Israel and call it a deal and start establishing economic and diplomatic ties? It makes way more sense to do the latter because I'm not a country like Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, or Egypt that borders with Israel. I've never had a war with Israel. And yeah, I can sympathize with the Palestinians, but ultimately, from a state perspective, it is way more beneficial and rational to strike a deal.
More lucrative, so to say, to have this kind of economic ties under the US umbrella.
Yeah.
And what do you think about Saudi Arabia? Are they going to normalize ties with Israel? I think it's upcoming.
It's in the making.
It's in the making. It's very close to finalization. And even a few years ago, I was talking to a friend, a New Yorker with the dual citizenship. He's now in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And he was traveling with US-Israeli delegations to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and these things are ongoing, and nobody doubts what will be the final outcome.
It is, Saudi Arabia, again, is unlike, for example, the Emirates or Bahrain or Morocco. Morocco is also, very far away anyway.
Of course.
But it is a country that has the capacity and the ambition, somebody would say, to actually become one of the regional hegemons in the Middle East. Now, Saudi Arabia now is not in the best shape ever. They're facing a lot of internal domestic issues. Number one. Number two, just because they're not just a little tiny emirate on the Gulf, they're a massive state. And they are a state with a specific religious sort of,
role.
I mean,
they have
we
a
do not need
spiritual
to delve.
role, whether people like the ruling dynasty or not, but Saudi Arabia is the most important Muslim state.
It goes with Sharif al-Haramain. I mean, they are the ones who are the custodians of Mecca and Medina. So they have that added, Islamic, how can I say, responsibility to an extent. Because Saudi Arabia, in that case, would be playing on to two levels, so to speak. One is the level within the Arab world. And given that a lot of its neighbors have already recognized Israel, it wouldn't be such an incredible step from an Arab perspective. However, you're also playing on the Islamic, the word Islamic Ummah, meaning that you are basically the seat of the Organization of the Islamic States, right? That's where you have your headquarters there. How can you, given the history of the confrontation between Israelis and Palestinians, recognize Israel, given your religious credentials, right? It's a very tricky position Saudi Arabia is in. However, I think it is a matter of how they're gonna do that as opposed to if they're gonna do that. And there are a couple of things that we may add to this about Saudi Arabia lately. First of all, when Israel signed the agreement with Abu Dhabi, I think with the Emirates, was the first country to do so. Saudi Arabia allowed Israeli airplanes to fly over its airspace already, which is a sign of we are on the same page pretty much. Okay. Second, and this is a move that Saudi Arabia, I think, made this in these days, kind of to buy time. When asked directly what they thought about the Abraham Accords, why they have not joined yet, the current elite, I cannot recall if it was King Salman or MBS, the heir apparent to the throne. Yeah, they remarked that they reiterated the proposition that they would like to have the so-called Abdullah Peace Plan of 2002 as opposed to the Abraham Accord. And for those of us who are listening here, basically it was a plan proposed by Saudi Arabia almost 20 years ago now, where the Arab League would have granted Israel recognition, full diplomatic relationship, if Israel had withdrawn to the June 4th, 1967 borders and allowed the creation of a Palestinian state, basically in the West Bank and Gaza. That's pretty much.
It's a fair proposal.
I mean, yeah, it's back then, it could still, I think, be operationalized. Now, I think everybody knows, even Saudi Arabia, that a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza is simply not viable. Just because we talked about the settlers and all the rest of it, the infrastructure that Israel has built over the years. But to me, that's why they know it as well. They know that the Abdullah Peace Plan cannot become true. It's not a viable plan anymore. If it was back then, which I'm not even sure, but if it was viable back then, definitely it's not.
I'm not sure either. In 2002, IDF controlled the border between Jordan and Palestinian territories. So what we're talking about, Palestinian territories created by Oslo are just Bantustans. From the very beginning, it was obvious that cities with Arab majority are like Bantustans in South Africa, surrounded by settlers, surrounded by IDF. And very soon we are going to have over 1 million Zionist settlers in the West Bank.
And that's why I think, if you and I know this, right? For sure, the Saudi authorities know it. And again, a reiteration of the Abdullah Peace Plan of 2002 is just a way to buy some time. And I'm not sure when they will sign on to the Abraham Accords, but I would bet they will eventually. Also because again, it makes, for Saudi Arabia, Israel is not a massive security threat, let alone a existential threat. They see Iran instead as an existential security threat. So if they can protect themselves with a bunch of states together with Israel, who also sees Iran in very similar fashion, then they, from a state logic perspective, it just makes more sense for them to join this agreement. We'll see when that happens.
In this context, we can also point out that recently Iraq became a mediator and negotiating place between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Absolutely.
These negotiations are going parallel with US and EU negotiations with Iran about the nuclear program and about inclusion of Iran into international community.
Yeah. I mean, you can look at the role. You just need to look at the map of the Middle East to see that Iraq is basically a buffer between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And with the fall of Saddam Hussein in 2003, Saudi Arabia saw, the math was not that complicated. 55%, 60% of Iraqis are Shiite. So that Iran has a possibility to exploit this fact to extend its grip over the country, which has tried to do quite effectively, if you ask me. And Saudi Arabia sees that as a major threat to its territory. There is nothing, between Iraq and Saudi Arabia. There's just desert, a plain desert. It's very easy to cross. So Saudi Arabia is fully aware of that, and Iraq, knowing its position and the ties that it has with both countries, Arab on the one hand with Saudi Arabia, and by virtue of its Shia majority in the country with Iran, can play that role. And whenever you can leverage on an asset that may improve your country position in the region, as Iraq is trying to do, I think, then of course you will do so. But I'm expecting Saudi Arabia to undergo quite dramatic domestic and social changes as well over the next few months and years. I think MBS, very controversial character.
Absolutely.
Very controversial. And we may dispute a lot of his choices, as we should. But I think he has understood something, that the kind of social political arrangement that has been working thus far for Saudi Arabia may not be lasting much longer. The kind of closed economic, social, and cultural system that has dominated the kingdom basically since its inception is not viable anymore for Saudi Arabia. And he has understood this. He has started this way of, I don't want to call it like modernization, it's basically trying to open up the country to foreign investment. And he needs also to release some of the strict societal and cultural control of the Wahhabi establishment. But that speaks to the fact that the royal court in Saudi Arabia is aware that challenges ahead are momentous, and we may be looking at a very different Saudi Arabia in the years to come. So we'll see what happens. Yep.
Regarding Shiites, we should also mention that in Saudi Arabia itself, 10 to 15% of citizens follow Shiite Islam. So you have
not only that,
of fifth column in Saudi Arabia, and Iran can destabilize Saudis by using 10 to 15% of Shiites within the Saudi borders.
Absolutely, and I would add to that, Sabi, as of course, absolutely correct to point it out. Not only that, where they are located also, this share is important, because they're all located in the eastern part of the kingdom where most of the oil is located, right?
Yeah.
And then on top of that, because they're Shia, and because of the stronger Wahhabi discourse that basically informs a lot of the practices and policies of, domestically speaking, of Saudi Arabia, they've also been discriminated against by the official Sunni Wahhabi establishment, which means that they have reasons to be, quote unquote, mad at the Saudi government, to the Saudi regime, right? So they basically created an alienated population which shares deep religious ties with your most, feared enemy, and it occupies the territory where your most important natural resource is actually located. So all that paints a picture that is quite problematic when it comes to Saudi internal stability. Yeah.
Regarding Omani officials postponed the decision to normalize ties with Israel after the US presidential election, which happened in November 3rd last year. But in February 2021, the foreign minister Bushaidi said that as regards to Israel, we are content so far with the level of our current relations and dialogue.
Yeah.
And so far they put the official normalization on the ice.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned Oman, and then we can also talk about Sudan that you mentioned in your introduction as well. So Oman is one. Look, nothing against Oman, right? But it's a marginal country. It's a small country, population between 2 to 3 million, I think. Relatively, well off for standards for the standards of the region. But to me, Oman reminds me of Austria in Europe. Austria is a country that throughout the Cold War, when there was massive kind of, confrontation between, of course, East Europe and Western Europe and, the Soviets and the Americans and yada, 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 Austria was like, look, we're not going to take parts in this. We are officially neutral, even though we wink, wink to the Western Bloc. Indeed, Austria is not considered part of, of Eastern Europe. It looks very much like a Western European country in all sorts of ways, but they're really smart in not alienating anybody. They were really smart in that regard. And Oman is doing the same thing. Oman has good relations with everybody around it, with Iran, with Saudi Arabia, with Israel, and with the United States as well, without overcommitting to any of these positions. And I think like Austria, it can do that because it's a relatively small country, and its weight in the region is not such that is demanded to have a certain kind of commitment, right? And back to Sudan instead. Sudan is one of the most interesting countries, just because it just for our readers, for our listeners, sorry.
Yeah.
It used to be the largest African states up until 2011, when the southern part became, I think, the most recent addition to the list of sovereign countries on the planet as South Sudan. Now, the northern part is still a massive territory that was ruled up until 2019 by Omar al-Bashir, a military dictator who was then ousted by I would say, social grassroots mobilization by and large, in which both civilians and military forces, partook in removing him. And then what happened was that they set in place this interim transition government, where the civilians were in charge but overlooked and controlled by the military. And I think 25th of October, the military basically claiming that there were security threats to the country, fears of civil war and stuff like that, basically took over in a old-fashioned, if you will, military coup. Yeah, and there've been protests and demonstrations and clashes also, with some people unfortunately died in the streets of Khartoum as of late. But the thing is that the interim government that was ousted on the 25th of October was getting cold feet, so to speak, about fully normalizing ties with Israel, especially the civilians, when they were, considering the framework of the Abraham Accords, wanted to move a little more cautiously, meaning that they were okay with establishing some economic ties. Some representatives of the Sudanese and Israeli governments met in the Emirates recently. So they were, of course, talking, they were in negotiation, they were, moving in that direction, but they didn't want to move as fast as the proponents, the supporters of the Accords would have loved, a little bit like Oman. And they wanted to see whether indeed recognizing Israel, establishing ties and exchanging ambassadors and embassies and all the rest of it was gonna make sense on their part. Now it seems that the new military junta in power may be more willing to just go for it and just sign the accords, which makes it for a quite complicated picture, just because the international community has condemned quite unanimously what happened in Khartoum, especially the United States didn't recognize the coup as a legitimate takeover of power. But also they're caught now in a conundrum, so to speak. If these guys are actually willing to sign quickly the Abraham Accords, are you going to close one eye and say, yeah, they will.
They will probably, because the Western powers have the history of tolerance towards very authoritarian and very repressive regimes who were useful for their interests in different regions. Yeah. They were more pragmatic than interested in spreading democracy and human rights.
That's for sure, Saib. And I think the United States may be in a position where they have a little bit of a carrot and the stick to make the new Sudanese government do as they please. However, we'll see what happens, because again, the Sudanese people in the streets are not content with this arrangement. And Sudan, of course, as of late, has a history of political instability over the last 2 to 3 years.
Yes.
So it's not a given that this guy actually will stay in power. And I think the United States are waiting to see who actually holds the reins of power in Khartoum, and then will make their move.
Do you think that all these circumstances and developments in the region will boost the Palestinian resistance now when they are isolated and cornered?
Very, very tough question, Sab. A very tough question.
Of course.
It is a tough question. It is hard for me to see the Palestinians giving up their political grievances. Simply because it is part of their identity as Palestinians to hold very dearly to their hearts this kind of political aspirations that they have. And I go back to the Trump plan, the so-called deal of the century, which basically entailed pouring some millions of dollars in a Palestinian economy, and try to spur and sustain a economic development of the Palestinians. Now, the way Palestinians read it, and I think correctly, was that the Trump administration was trying to buy them off. Just forget about politics, enjoy some money, go consume stuff, and forget about your political grievances. And not surprisingly, Palestinians, by and large, were like, we're not going to sell our cause, which is tightly tied to our identity as a people, just because you're going to give us money, right? So and this happened like 1.5 years ago. It's like, we're not talking about centuries ago, right? It's a very recent thing. If that was the general mood of the Palestinian people, it is very hard for me to see how the Palestinians, even in the long run, let alone in the short or medium run, can give up their political stance, right? And we'll see what happens. It's incredibly hard to predict such a complicated issue. Of course, I'm saying something that is quite banal here, but we have to realize something, that the Palestinian issue is, for all intents and purposes, a domestic issue of the Israeli government, because Israel basically exercises sovereignty either directly onto 1.2, 1.5, even more than that, almost 2 million Palestinians who have an Israeli passport, the so-called Arab Israelis.
If we talk about Palestinian Arabs
who
are Israeli citizens, they are over 2 million.
Yeah, and then on top of them, you also have another, 4 millions almost between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank.
We're talking about the population. We're talking about the population which is almost equal to the population of Israelis or Israeli settlers or Jews, whatever that term means, because it's another topic, and we know that it's more of a cultural concept than ethnic concept.
Yeah, absolutely. But the Palestinians who live not in the diaspora outside the historic land of Palestine, all of them, either directly or indirectly, are under Israeli sovereignty, which means that Israel will have to deal with it sooner or later. And this is one of the issues that Israel has to confront, and I'm not sure when the chickens will come home to roost, so to speak, but they will. It is not a situation that can go on indefinitely. So we'll see, Saab. But to your questions, whether the Palestinians are gonna dig their heels even in a firmer fashion in the ground, probably. I do not see the situation changing on their part.
I think we'll witness more escalations and de-escalations of violence in Palestinian territories.
Yeah,
Like what happened
absolutely.
in May. In May, we had a few weeks of bombardment, and it's very likely that we're going to have similar confrontations in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can also, I mean, the dynamics again of this very small piece of land, right, are so complicated that I don't think there is a parallel outside, the Israeli-Palestinian case that you can actually apply. But Israel, on top of the issue with the Palestinians who are Israeli citizens or not Israeli citizens, it has also other issues with the different tribes, so to speak, that make up the Israeli society, right? The Orthodox on the one hand, the religious Zionists, the secular Zionists. So it's hard.
Not only that, they have different ethnic background. Ashkenazims and Mizrahis are not from the same ethnic background. I'm not saying this myself, but we have Israeli scholars and historians like Shlomo Sen, and they have his book here. Where is this? Yeah, this is the book from 2013-14, The Invention of the Jewish People. It's a well-known book, and I recommend this. And he's not the only scholar who claims that the fabric of the society is artificial and created by different group of settlers. So they have their own internal problems, which are pushed under the rug because of the hostility from the Arabic side. If they don't have a hostile environment and hostile neighborhood, they would probably fight themselves.
I think this observation is quite a interesting comment on your part, because how do you keep such a diverse society together? You can do that more easily if you have an external enemy that kind of provides external pressure to make sure that everybody coalesces together. Yeah, if Israel loses, the Arab threat, because most Arab countries are going to be, recognizing Israel, the ones who have not already done it. If Iran as a threat is then kind of, de-emphasized just because, either the Abraham Accords or the international community recognizes Iran as a non-threatening player, if all those fears that helped Israel coalesce and gather a sense of commonness in its population basically evaporate, they're not there anymore, what happens internally? What happens to the groups of people that make up Israel in the absence of a relevant pressing external threat? And the Palestinian issue may rise up again as the most pressing one, together with the other domestic rift and cleavages that we have just described.
I would stop here, and we can continue next time.
Absolutely.
We always have very nice conversations, and talking about the Middle East is a conversation with all kinds of twists and turns and all kinds of unlimited scenarios, because of the local dynamics that we are facing. Unfortunately, the region is not pacified. It's not Scandinavia, and probably it will never be like those happy countries on the north.
Or we may not be able to witness that side.
Yeah, we're not going to witness that. I'm not going to live 500 years. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, sir. Thank you so much.
Bye.